So this is my Animar Soul of Elements commander deck, and I built this deck to take advantage of probably my favorite mechanic in the game. If you've ever played Limited during Onslaught block, then you'll remember how basically any creature with Morph was playable because it's a 2/2 for 3. So you could look down a table full of games going on and see like a couple dozen face-down creatures, and it was just the idea that, those creatures could be anything. So it could be a scornful egotist, or a exalted angel, or even like a basic forest. So it was just the possibility of anything that made it so exciting. So attacking or blocking each turn was like playing 3-card Monty. It was hilarious. So I really wanted to turn Morph into an EDH deck somehow, and when Animar was spoiled with the Commander box set a while ago, I knew this was definitely the general to do it. I always wanted to build 5-color Morph so that you could take advantage of all the creatures, but it's not really possible with the generals you have access to, and Animar is clearly the best general to take advantage of Morph. Animar is obviously a very, very powerful general, and you can do some pretty disgusting things with him. Building a Morph deck isn't really one of them. This is decidedly a casual application of Animar, but you'd be surprised. This deck can build up an army of 2/2s faster than you can blink, so if you underestimate it in a multiplayer game, it can do some pretty devastating things. So the idea with this deck is to get Animar out, and then power out a bunch of free Morph creatures backed up with some crazy draw engines, and then hopefully pulling off some sort of combo or just attacking with a gigantic Animar. The game plan seems to change every game depending on which of your crappy little Morph creatures you get out. But one thing's for sure, this is definitely a hilarious deck to play with or play against, and it can do some pretty silly things sometimes. So I'll show you this deck, and maybe I can get a few other fans of Morph to build an Animar deck like this one. So the first card I want to talk about is Animar himself. I guess the first thing to note is that he puts us into blue, red, green, which is a strange color combination, but it actually works fairly well in this deck. Blue gives you access to counter magic, green gives you access to ramp, and red gives you access to Wheel of Fortune. So really it's all of the things you want to protect your general, make sure you've got a ton of mana out, and get your draw engines going. Animar himself costs 3 mana, which is very handy because you need to have him out as soon as possible before you start powering out Morph creatures. It doesn't really help you very much to power out these creatures when he's not in play because they don't become cheaper and they don't give you that handy +1/+1 counter. Animar is actually a pretty handy win condition on his own because he can get big very quickly and can kill someone with general damage pretty easily, actually. His lack of proper evasion is kind of a drawback. Protection from white and black makes him difficult to block against certain decks, and it protects him from some of the worst spot removal. So that's actually very handy, but it helps if you can give him trample somehow. So there are a few ways that this deck can make Animar even more difficult to block. He's just a 1/1 at first. That doesn't really matter because he's not going to be getting into combat until he gets huge. But yeah, the fact that he costs only 3 mana makes him pretty ideal in a 3-color deck. So I'll start by going through the creatures, and this is what the mana curve looks like. It's not really a curve, it's mostly just a bazillion Morph creatures, all of which cost 3, obviously, and then a handful of other select creatures, which give us some nasty draw engines, or just happen to work very well with Morphs. So yeah, it was kind of a bit of restraint to resist going the obvious route and adding a bunch of awesome artifact creatures, because the Affinity Animar deck just seems way too obvious and boring. So we really did go full on with the Morph theme quite zealously, as you can see. So I will take you through all of these Morph creatures. And really when you're running 32 Morph creatures, basically any creature with Morph with a reasonable ability is playable, sadly. So there is some junk in here, and you'll get to see all of it. Alright, so like I said before, if you're running 32 Morph creatures, you have to go pretty deep into the card pool. There's some pretty crappy ones, but we managed to weed out the ones that are absolute garbage. So most of the Morphs in this deck at least have some useful abilities. Starting off with these two, Skirk Marauder and Skirk Commando. There's not a whole lot to say. These guys were like first picks back in the days of Onslaught Block Limited. Yeah, they just get flipped up and deal 2 damage. One of them just shocks right away, and one of them works whenever it deals combat damage. 2 damage isn't a whole lot in Commander, but it actually blows away a lot of those nasty utility commanders like Arkham Dax and Joyra, Azami, etc. So 1 shock is actually pretty useful. Echo Tracer, not much to say. It flips up and it's a mana war, so yeah, that's okay. Dwarven Blast Miner, already a very playable commander card, so he obviously just fits right into this deck. Shellscum Plower, he just flips up as a Stone Rain. Land Destruction is obviously very useful in commander. And Antico Vigilante flips up as a Naturalize. So, not much to say about any of these guys, they're just sort of common morph creatures with random destroy target permanent type abilities. Here are a couple morphs that have some card draw abilities. I'm not sure how much I mentioned this before, but card draw engines are actually pretty key for the success of this deck. Because you're going to be vomiting 2/2 creatures for free onto the table, your hand gets empty pretty quickly. So having ways to draw lots of cards and draw more morphs to throw onto the battlefield is very important. So here are some morph creatures with card draw abilities. Riptide Survivor flips up and gives you a bit of card advantage there. Fathom Seer makes you bounce 2 islands to your hand, which is kind of annoying, but that is 2 free cards. Unblinking Bleb. This guy is pretty cool because he works well with the other morphs you have, and this is actually a pretty disgusting card sometimes. To be honest, you're not actually unmorphing your creatures very much. A lot of the time they just sort of stay face down as 2/2 creatures because you don't really have the mana to put into activating those morph costs. But when you have Unblinking Bleb face up, then it is actually very worthwhile to start flipping up your morph creatures. Any blue deck should have access to some counter magic, and it's only fitting that we have some morph creatures who give us some counter spells. Void Mage Apprentice just flips up and counters target spell, always very useful. Void Mage Prodigy, sort of the same deal, except you can sacrifice wizards. There's a handful of wizards in this deck, so you might be able to take advantage of the tribal aspect there. Willbender, always a playable card in any commander deck, but especially good in a morph-centric deck. Mischievous Quainer, this card is just kind of fun. You can copy target instant or sorceries, which will always be useful in a commander game, because someone is casting Wheel of Fortune or Tooth and Nail somewhere, and you want to get in on that action. Now we get into some morph creatures with some pretty neat abilities. These are creatures that all take advantage of a morph heavy deck that also has a lot of creatures in it. I don't know why I said that. Morph heavy decks obviously have lots of creatures in them. Anyways, Master of the Veil flips up and lets you put a morph creature face down. Weaver of Lies, the same deal, except you can put any number of morph creatures face down. I feel like these cards were more relevant back when every deck used to have morph. I don't think you're going to see many other morph creatures in an EDH game other than the ones in your deck. Dermoplasm flips face up and puts morph creatures from your hand into play, and that's similar to Root Elemental, sort of the same deal, except the creature does not have to have morph. So these guys just let you cheat out some expensive creatures. Some more nifty creatures with morph abilities. Yeah, it seems like blue seems to have the coolest morph creatures, in my opinion. Riptide Entrancer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can steal one of their creatures, which is very cool. Kind of similar to Chromeshell Crab, which flips up and does the Gilded Drake ability. One of the better morphs in this deck, in my opinion. And Vesuvian Shapeshifter flips up and copies creatures in play, and you can flip it back down. So this is another very cool creature in this deck. A couple decidedly random morph creatures with some very neat abilities. Brine Elemental is obviously a pretty notorious one for pulling off combos. You can force people to skip their untap steps, and it's pretty easy to abuse this guy and make it so that you're flipping him up every single turn. And there's a number of ways to do that in this deck. So, you know, Cloudstone Curio, Tidespout Tyrant. Anyway, you can bounce him back to your hand and then bring him out again for cheap. He's going to be pretty abusive. So that's one of the douchier ways this deck can just sort of lock the entire table out of the game. And then Fortune Thief, just one of the coolest creatures in this deck. I hate playing against this card when I know it's in this deck because I just know that my lethal damage might not necessarily be lethal. So yeah, he's Worship on a stick, and it's just randomly hilarious when this guy comes face up and no one sees it coming. So I've shown you lots of blue morph creatures so far because they're the ones that give you the nice tricky abilities like counter magic, stealing creatures, and bouncing stuff. But green gives you access to a lot of the super aggressive morph creatures. So some of them are just big dumb beat sticks, or give you access to some cool tokens like this guy. He's a pretty neat morph that nobody seems to see coming. So he can block a gigantic general and make a billion insect tokens. Thalanite Hermit, probably one of the single most aggressive morph creatures in this deck, actually. So he flips up and makes 9 power worth of creatures, which is pretty devastating, actually. Histrodon, actually one of my favorite morph creatures, because he was one of the first cards to have that Ophidian ability in green. Tribal Force Mage, this guy is actually really important in this deck. Like I said before, Animar is kind of tricky to win with because he doesn't have much evasion outside of his protection. So being able to give him trample is actually pretty huge. So you can flip this guy up and name elementals, and then Animar can get in there with trample damage. So he's very handy. And then Primal Whisperer is just a beating, because you can easily get a dozen face-down creatures in play at a time. So he flips up and can possibly be the most dangerous card on the table. And rounding out the last of the morph creatures, we've just got some big dumb beat sticks. Rock Shard Elemental, sure, why not? Double Striker. Chroma Angel of Fury, obviously one of the better aggressive morph creatures in this deck. So she's got a whole bunch of really cool abilities, and she can be a pain in the ass to deal with. Quicksilver Dragon, one that no one seems to see coming. He's got that cool redirect ability. This is why it's always fun to play against this deck, because you've got sort of that 3-card Monty feeling going, when you've got like 6 morph creatures on the table, and you have to point to Vindicate at one of them. So you can get really unlucky and hit this guy. It's pretty funny. And then, yeah, you're in dire straits when you're running a vanilla 9/9, but why not? This guy's just funny. And of course the 13/13. So yeah, just getting super aggressive with this deck and attacking with some giant morph creatures is not outside the realm of possibility. So these guys plus that last batch I showed you, like Primal Whisperer, it's pretty easy to just get there with 40 points of damage on top of a constantly swelling Animar. So now I'll take you through the non-morph creatures. And as I said, draw engines are very important to this deck because you're throwing all those morph creatures from your hand into play, and you want to get some value out of them before they get wrathed away. So any sort of effect that lets you draw a card for each creature you have is obviously going to be very good in this deck. There's quite a few creatures that give you effects like this. Here are some of the best ones. You've got Primordial Sage and Soul of the Harvest with pretty similar effects. Just straight up, whenever you play a creature, you get to draw a card. So when 1/3 of your deck is morph creatures, it's pretty possible that when you're playing them for free, you're just going to sort of keep replacing a morph in your hand with another one on top of your deck, and you just get this sort of disgusting engine going of free creatures from the top of your deck. So speaking of free creatures from the top of your deck, Magus of the Future and Garruk's Horde both allow you to play the top card of your library, if it's a creature, in the case of Garruk's Horde. So you can morph creatures from the top of your deck, in case you're wondering. So this is sort of similar to Primordial Sage and Soul of the Harvest. You're basically getting a free card when you're casting it from the top of your deck. And lastly, we've just got some creatures that work well with our game plan. Tidespout Tyrant, when you're throwing down a whole bunch of morph creatures in one turn, the ability to bounce a permanent each time is obviously very useful. He also enables a few combos in this deck, which I'll talk about later. Ixodor Reality Sculptor seems like a pretty obvious choice. The beatdown strategy is actually a pretty viable one in this deck. Even if you're just swinging in with an army of 2/2s, you'd be surprised how quickly you can overwhelm somebody with that. So turning them to 3/3s can actually be pretty useful. And of course the ability to turn your morph creatures face up for only 3 mana is very handy as well. Ixodron is a pretty popular card even in regular commander decks, but he obviously works very well in this deck because you can actually take advantage of turning your creatures face down. His ability is pretty nasty on commanders because they don't just go to the command zone, right? They just turn into these 2/2 dorks that your opponent's desperately trying to kill so that they can get their commanders back into the commander zone. And obviously this guy is a pretty nasty beat stick all on his own as well. Well, not on his own, assuming there's a whole bunch of other creatures out. Sometimes Animar can get caught in the crossfire with this guy, and he gets stuck face down. But he does retain those +1/+1 counters, I'm pretty sure, and I think he still deals commander damage, so that's pretty handy. Getting into the non-creatures, obviously there isn't a whole lot of room for non-creature spells because you have to dedicate so many spots to morph creatures. Like I said before, draw engines are very important to the success of this deck, so we have some of the most powerful ones right here. Wheel of Fortune obviously is a auto-include in any red commander deck, really without exception. Memory Jar is going to work very well in this deck. Even if you have to tap out for the Memory Jar, usually you play the Memory Jar and then activate it next turn, so you've got the mana for it. Sometimes you just pop this right away because morph creatures are free. Future Sight is obviously very good in a deck like this. It's the same as Magus of the Future, as we saw earlier. Sensei's Divine Top is just going to go into any commander deck, but of course it's awesome in any deck that also has Future Sight. Cloudstone Curio, one of those especially nasty combo pieces. This is going to work very well in any deck that can power out free creatures, because then you can set up some nasty engines. Basically this with 2 morph creatures can make an infinitely large Animar and trigger come into play abilities like Tidespout Tyrant. So there are some pretty disgusting things with Cloudstone Curio. Recycle is a pretty cool draw engine. Whenever you play a card, draw a card. So that sort of works the same as those Primordial Sage, Soul of the Harvest type cards that we saw earlier. But this will also trigger off land drops and other random spells. Of course, there's always the risk that you'll get mind twisted with this out and be stuck not drawing cards for the rest of the game. But it's pretty worth it, because if you get this thing going, it can do some pretty disgusting things in this deck. Weird Harvest is one of those group hug cards that actually sort of has a place in this deck. So for 2 green and an X, each player searches the deck for up to X creature cards and puts them into their hand. So the cool thing with this is that usually you plan to win the game the turn you cast it, because otherwise giving your opponent a whacking pile of free creatures is going to kill you. So you're going to use this to search for, a dozen morph creatures and just vomit them all onto the field for free and give Animar +12/+12. So you can also use this to get the Primal Whisper or the Tribal Force Mage that you need to give your Animar trample, or whatever other key creature that you need at the time. So Weird Harvest is actually a pretty interesting gem in this deck. I'm definitely missing some of the more notable draw engines that would work well in this deck. Like Glimpse of Nature, I think is what the card is called, and whatever other cards let you draw cards equal to the number of creatures you have to play or whatever. This deck was just sort of put together with whatever extra cards we had lying around, so I'm pretty sure we're missing some of the more important pieces, but I'm sure you guys can figure out which ones those are. Getting into the more boring stuff, I am physically incapable of building a blue deck without some counter magic. It's sort of my thing. So just a small set, only 6 spells. Counterspell, Arcane Denial, Cryptic Command. As you can tell, I love my cheap hard counters. Hinder and Spell Crumple, those are always fun. And Pact of Negation, free counter spells are always awesome. Especially in a deck where you're tapping out every turn and keeping your commander alive is tantamount to success. Some boring, cheap utility removal. Pongify is one of the better removal spells in the format, I've recently discovered. So killing a creature for just 1 blue mana at instant speed is fantastic. Giving them a 3/3, not that big of a deal. Although it's annoying that that 3/3 happens to be able to block Animar. Beast Within also gives them a 3/3 beast, but being able to destroy any permanent at instant speed is just way too good. And lastly, we've got some mana ramp. This is a green deck that actually doesn't need to ramp that much because your general has some built-in ramp capabilities. But we do have some of the better ramp spells. Soul Ring, Coalition Relic, helps for mana fixing because this deck doesn't really have an ideal mana base. And then just a few decent sorceries. So Explosive Vegetation and Cultivating Kadama's Reach. Getting into the mana base, most of the lands in this deck are dedicated to making sure that we actually have access to our 3 colors so that we can cast Animar on turn 3. But there are a handful of pretty useful colorless utility lands. Zoetic Cavern, yeah, check it out. There's a land with Morph, so yeah, that kind of makes sense in this deck. Strip Mine and Tectonic Edge, it's nice to be able to destroy lands, so that's why those are here. Kessig Wolfrun, this is kind of a neat addition in this deck. Like I said before, Animar struggles from not having trample, so it's handy to have a land that can give your general trample, so that's why that's in here. A few more utility lands. Mossor Bridge just makes sense in a deck that's going to have a massive army very quickly. This is actually one of my favorite lands in this format. So yeah, just accumulate a bunch of creatures and then you get a free card at instant speed. Teleria West, just a handy little tutor that comes on a land. The Transmute can get you Pact of Negation, but most of the time it's going to get a Gaia's Cradle, which I'll show you in a second. Cephalid Colosseum, a very useful card. Like I said, this deck loves its draw engines, so being able to pop this land late game to see 3 new cards is very handy. And Gaia's Cradle is just going to be excellent in a deck which has more than 40 creatures. So yeah, this generates a ton of mana, and it's great for powering out a huge Weird Harvest. So on to the dual lands. We've got the M10 Innistrad lands, the Pain lands, Shadowmoor Eventide Filter lands, some decent 3-color lands, City Brass Command Tower, Rupture Spire, Exotic Orchard, Vivid lands, the on-color fetch lands, and a solitary shock land. These are going to be easier to come by soon, which I'm looking forward to. This is obviously far from an optimized mana base, because those are expensive. As you can tell, with the exception of Gaia's Cradle, this is a very budget deck list, which is good because you don't want to break the bank on a crappy morph-themed deck. And rounding out the mana base, we have 5 islands, 5 forests, 2 mountains. So the game plan for this deck is pretty interesting. You've got a few ways you can win, but all of those ways involve getting Animar out as soon as possible. So he needs to hit the battlefield on turn 3 every game, and he needs to hopefully stick around for a few turns. As soon as he's out, you're going to start casting these morphs. Morphs are pretty bad, but they're fun because they have some interesting utility abilities. It's nice to have access to all of these during a game. The draw engines are very important, so stuff like Recycle, Weird Harvest, and all of those Wheel of Fortune effects, those all work really well in this deck. Ways that you can take advantage of having tons of creatures like Soul of the Harvest, those are great as well. And utility cards that let you protect Animar, those are useful as well. Once you've got a board full of morph creatures, there's a few ways you can win. You can pull off some sort of combo win with Brine Elemental, Tidespout Tyrant, or Cloudstone Curio. It's pretty easy to assemble some sort of combo involving these cards because your creatures are basically free, and using like Cloudstone Curio, you can keep recasting them to come into play your morph abilities or triggers off of Tidespout Tyrant. Going for the beatdown win is pretty easy. Stuff like Thelonite Hermit, Primal Whisperer, or just Ixidor or Giant Vanilla creatures. These can get there pretty quickly when you're morphing these creatures out for free and flipping them up through some sort of cheap means. There's also the commando damage win, which is entirely possible because Animar gets gigantic pretty quickly, and if your opponent happens to be relying very heavily on white or black, then he can be a big pain to deal with. So if you're going to go that route, you definitely want to have at least a few ways to give your general trample. So Kessig Wolfrun is a handy one. Tribal Force Mage is a morph creature who can do it. You just need to be prepared to give Animar some sort of evasion. So that's the deck. Like I said, it's probably not built optimally, so it's definitely just a casual deck, but it can deal some serious damage because people don't seem to take it seriously when they find out it's a morph combo deck. But like any deck built around Animar, it's going to have some pretty disgusting interactions whether you intend it to or not. So I hope someone else tries to build a morph combo deck because I've definitely seen a few people try it before. So it's definitely it's definitely an acquired taste, but it's a lot of fun once you put it together. So I hope you enjoyed this deck.